In the hallowed halls of the Grand Ole Opry, some legends are carved from rough-hewn honky-tonk timber. They are the hellraisers, the outlaws, the voices of heartbreak and Saturday night sin. And then there are the gentlemen, the ones who stepped onto that sacred stage in a perfectly tailored suit, with a smile as smooth as their voice, and a presence that was both commanding and comforting. For nearly 50 years, no one embodied that grace and style quite like BillyWalker. They called him the Tall Texan, a 6'6" crooner with a voice like warm honey and a string of hits that became the soundtrack for a generation. He was a constant, a reassuring figure in the ever-changing world of country music. But behind the polished persona and the chart-topping success was a life defined by two staggering brushes with fate. One saw him narrowly escape one of the most infamous tragedies in music history, a twist of luck so profound it would haunt him for the rest of his days. The other would bring his story to a sudden, violent, and heartbreaking end. This is the story of a man who was given a second chance at life, and the tragic irony of how that life was ultimately taken. It's the story of the life he lived on borrowed time. To truly understand BillyWalker, you must first picture the world that forged him. He was born William Alfred Walker on January 14, 1929, in Ralls, Texas. Ralls is a small town in the flat, expansive plains of the Texas Panhandle, a place where the sky feels immense and the horizon is an endless, unbroken line. In 1929, this was a land on the brink of catastrophe. The stock market was about to crash, heralding the Great Depression, and the region itself was about to be ravaged by the Dust Bowl. Life in Ralls was a testament to human endurance, a daily struggle against economic hardship and the caprices of nature. The local economy was almost entirely dependent on cotton farming, a grueling, uncertain existence tied to the price of a single commodity. This was the environment that shaped Billy's character, pragmatic, hard-working, and deeply appreciative of the simple things. But amidst the hardship, there were conduits to a wider, more magical world. The most important of these was the radio. In the 1930s, for an isolated family in rural Texas, the radio was not just an appliance, it was a lifeline to the nation's culture. It brought news, comedy, and drama, but most importantly, it brought music. Through the static and crackle of an AM signal, the sounds of a distant, glamorous America filled the small farmhouses. On Saturday nights, the Walker family, like millions of others, would gather around their set and tune in to WSM from Nashville, Tennessee, for the live broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry. For a young, sensitive boy like Billy, these broadcasts were transformative. Listening to the pioneering voices of the genre, the mournful yodel of Jimmy Rogers, the heartfelt hymns of the Carter family, the raw honky-tonk of Ernest Tubb, was like hearing a new language. It was a language of storytelling, of shared joy and sorrow, and it spoke directly to his soul. This weekly ritual planted a powerful dream to one day stand on that stage himself. His artistic inclinations were encouraged by his mother, a woman with a creative spirit who wrote poetry, instilling in her son a love for language and emotional expression that would become a hallmark of his later singing style. When he was a teenager, he acquired his first guitar and began the patient process of teaching himself to play, picking out the melodies of his radio heroes. It quickly became apparent that he possessed a remarkable natural gift. His voice was not the reedy, high, lonesome sound common in the music of the era. It was a rich, smooth baritone, a crooner's voice with an innate warmth and clarity. It was a voice that seemed destined for something more than just family sing-alongs. As he grew into his full, impressive height, his quiet charisma and handsome features completed the picture. He was a natural-born performer, even if he didn't know it yet. The end of World War II unleashed a new wave of prosperity and cultural energy across the nation, and Texas was at the heart of it. The state's music scene exploded with a uniquely Texan sound, a fusion of traditional country, big band jazz, and blues known as Western swing, pioneered by legends like Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys. At the same time, the rougher, electrified sound of honky-tonk music was pouring out of the dance halls and beer joints. It was a vibrant, competitive, and fertile ground for a young singer looking to make his mark. After finishing high school and serving a brief stint in the military, BillyWalker began to pursue his dream in earnest. He started performing on local radio stations, his smooth style offering a polished alternative to the grittier sounds of his contemporaries. His big break came when he won a local talent competition, the prize for which was the chance to audition for the biggest show in the state. In the early 1950s, the center of the Texas music universe was the Dallas Sportatorium, a cavernous, unair-conditioned wrestling arena that on Saturday nights transformed into the home of the Big D Jamboree. Broadcast live on KRLD radio, the Jamboree was a raucous star-making machine. It was a rival to the Opry in both popularity and influence, a launching pad for the careers of future legends like Webb Pierce, Lefty Frizzell, Ray Price, and Charlene Arthur. For a Texas artist, getting a spot on the Big D Jamboree was the ultimate goal. BillyWalker passed his audition with flying colors and, in 1951, became a regular cast member. It was here that he was christened the Tall Texan, a nickname that perfectly captured his commanding presence and would stick with him for the rest of his life. The Jamboree was his finishing school. He honed his craft, learned how to work a crowd, and developed the confident, easygoing stage persona that would become his trademark. He formed his own band, the Texas Ranch Hands, and quickly became one of the show's most popular attractions. His success led to a recording contract with Columbia Records, a major national label. In 1954, he scored his first significant chart hit with the upbeat "Thank You for Calling," a song that showcased his clean, radio-friendly sound. He was now a bona fide star, at least in Texas and across the Southwest. He was a headliner, a recording artist, and a familiar voice on the radio. His dream was taking shape, but the mid-50s would place him at a historic crossroads, face to face with a force that was about to change music forever. As a popular touring act, Billy was part of the package tour circuit, where multiple artists would travel together by car, playing a different town every night. In 1955, he found himself booked on a tour with a wild, mesmerizing young performer from Sun Records in Memphis. This singer's name was Elvis Presley, and he was unlike anything Billy or anyone else had ever seen. Walker would later recall these shows with a sense of awe. He described the palpable, almost frightening energy in the room when Elvis took the stage. He witnessed the hip swiveling, the leg shaking, and the electrifying effect it had on the teenage girls in the audience, who would scream and cry with an intensity that was completely unprecedented. This was the collision of two worlds. On one side was BillyWalker, the consummate country gentleman, representing the established order of polished professionalism. On the other was Elvis Presley, a raw, primal force of nature tearing down the walls between country, blues, and pop, and inventing rock and roll in the process. While many in the conservative country music establishment viewed Elvis with suspicion and disdain, Billy had a more nuanced perspective. He recognized the revolutionary talent and the undeniable star power. He saw the future of popular music unfolding before his very eyes. This period provided him with a unique vantage point on one of the most pivotal moments in 20th century culture, a story he would recount for years to come. Despite his success, the ultimate dream, the one that had been sparked by those childhood nights listening to the radio, was still the Grand Ole Opry. In the late 1950s, he made the difficult decision to leave his comfortable perch as a big star in Texas and relocate to Nashville to compete on the national stage. The transition was not seamless. Nashville was a different world with its own cliques and power structures. While his talent was respected, breaking into the top tier of the Nashville scene was a challenge. He finally achieved his lifelong ambition in 1960 when he was officially invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry. It was a moment of immense personal and professional triumph. Yet for the next 2 years, he found himself in a peculiar kind of limbo. He was a member of the most prestigious institution in country music, performing on its hallowed stage every week, but a major, career-defining hit record remained just out of his grasp. He was a star, but not yet a superstar. That all changed in 1962 when he recorded a song by a songwriter named Roy Baham. The song was a simple, elegant country ballad about a man haunted by the memory of his lost love, a memory triggered by seeing another man wearing the departed's shoes. It was called Charlie's Shoes. The song was a perfect match for Walker's emotive crooning style. His performance was a masterpiece of subtlety and control, conveying a world of heartache without a single overwrought note. The record was an immediate and colossal success. It shot to the #1 spot on the Billboard country charts and stayed there, establishing BillyWalker as one of the biggest names in the business. He had finally arrived. He followed it up with another solid hit, Willie the Weeper. And as 1963 dawned, the Tall Texan was standing at the very summit of his profession, cemented by the massive success of Charlie's Shoes. The boy from the cotton fields of Rawls had realized his wildest dreams. The future seemed to hold nothing but promise, a long celebrated career stretching out before him. He had no way of knowing that just a few weeks later, a simple act of kindness in a fog-bound airport would place him at the center of a tragedy that would shake the foundations of country music and redefine his own life forever. This pinnacle of success achieved through years of hard work and talent thrust BillyWalker into the very center of the country music world. In the early 1960s, this was an intimate circle, a traveling family of stars who shared stages, tour buses, and a deep sense of camaraderie born from a shared journey. It was this very sense of community that would soon call them all to Kansas City for an act of charity. For Billy, it seemed like just another performance, another chance to stand among his friends and peers at the height of his powers. He had no idea that this gathering of the faithful would lead him to a single fateful decision, where a simple gesture of friendship would be weighed against the very value of his life. By the first months of 1963, BillyWalker was living the dream he had chased since his boyhood in Rawls, Texas. His #1 hit, Charlie's Shoes, had transformed him from a respected Grand Ole Opry member into a premier A-list star. His smooth baritone was a constant presence on the nation's airwaves, and his schedule was a whirlwind of sold-out concerts, television appearances, and recording sessions. He had achieved a level of success that few artists ever touch. But in the world of country music, success was inextricably linked to community. The stars of the era were not distant, isolated figures. They were a tight-knit, albeit competitive family. They toured together, wrote together, and when tragedy struck, they rallied together. It was this sense of community that brought a glittering assembly of country music royalty to the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Kansas City, Kansas, on Sunday, March 3rd, 1963. They were there for a benefit concert, a country music spectacular, organized to support the family of a beloved local disc jockey, Cactus Jack Call, who had recently been killed in a car accident. The lineup was a staggering showcase of the genre's biggest names, the fiery and brilliant Patsy Cline, then at the absolute peak of her powers, the veteran Opry star Cowboy Copas, the charismatic Hawkshaw Hawkins, the up-and-coming Dottie West, and of course the Tall Texan himself, BillyWalker. It was a day of camaraderie and shared purpose, the stars donating their time and talent to help one of their own. The concert was a huge success, with 3 sold-out performances raising thousands for the Call family. As the final curtain fell, the mood was one of tired satisfaction. The work was done, and now all that was left was the long trip back home to Nashville. Travel in the 1960s for a touring musician was an exhausting, unglamorous affair, a grueling grind of long-haul drives between shows. For the top-tier stars, however, there was a faster, more exclusive option: private aviation. Patsy Cline, ever the trailblazer, often flew between gigs in a small single-engine Piper Comanche aircraft piloted by her manager and brother-in-law, Randy Hughes. The plane was a symbol of her hard-won success, a way to bypass the endless miles of highway and maximize her time at home with her young children. For the trip back from Kansas City, there were 2 available seats on her plane. One was taken by Cowboy Copas, the other was booked by BillyWalker. As the performers gathered after the show, making their post-mortem pleasantries and planning their departures, a simple conversation took place that would become enshrined in the mythology of country music. Hawkshaw Hawkins, a tall, handsome singer and a close friend of Walker's, approached him. Hawkins was famously a devoted family man. His wife, fellow Opry star Jean Shepard, had given birth to their son, Don Robin, just a few days prior. Hawkshaw was understandably desperate to get back to Nashville to be with them. The commercial flights were slower and less certain. He knew Walker had a seat on Patsy's plane, and he made a simple, friendly request. Would Billy consider swapping places with him? For BillyWalker, a man known for his easygoing nature and generosity, the decision was uncomplicated. He understood a new father's desire to get home. It was a small gesture of friendship, an act of kindness that cost him nothing. Of course, he would give up his seat. They made the arrangement, and the 2 friends parted ways, likely with a handshake and a promise to see each other back at the Opry the following weekend. Billy then made his way to the commercial airport to book a ticket on a later flight. It was a seemingly insignificant moment, a minor logistical change in a busy travel schedule, the kind of small decision that happens 1,000 times a day without a second thought. But this single benevolent act had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would spare one life and seal the fate of another. The following day, Monday, March 4th, the performers were grounded. A thick, impenetrable fog had descended upon Kansas City, making air travel impossible. They spent the day waiting in their hotels, anxious to get moving. On Tuesday, March 5th, the weather was still marginal, dismal, rainy, and with a low cloud ceiling. But Hughes, an inexperienced pilot not certified for instrument flying, was determined to press on. He checked the weather reports, which were foreboding, but he believed he could fly under the storm system. At the Fairfax Municipal Airport, the airfield manager advised them against taking off. But Patsy, famously impatient and headstrong, was quoted as saying, "Don't worry about us, Hoss. We'll be there." At 2 p.m., the small Piper Comanche, carrying Randy Hughes, Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins, taxied down the runway and lifted off into the murky, gray sky. Meanwhile, BillyWalker was at the commercial airport dealing with his own set of weather-related frustrations. His flight was delayed, and he settled in for a long wait. He later recalled sitting in the terminal with another country star, Ray Price, simply passing the time. As the hours ticked by, Walker described feeling a strange and overwhelming sense of unease, a gnawing anxiety he couldn't explain. He eventually boarded his flight, which made a scheduled layover in St. Louis. As he walked through the airport terminal to his connecting gate, his eyes were drawn to a television monitor broadcasting the evening news. A headline flashed across the screen, words that stopped him cold. Small plane carrying Grand Ole Opry stars missing. In that instant, the world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from his face. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was Patsy's plane. The uneasy feeling he'd had all day crystallized into sheer terror. The rest of the journey was a blur of frantic phone calls and agonizing uncertainty. When he finally landed in Nashville, the news was even worse. The plane hadn't just gone missing, it had gone down. Hard. The search was on, but hope was fading fast. All through the night, the Nashville music community held its breath, praying for a miracle. The miracle never came. The next morning, the wreckage of the Piper Comanche was discovered in a remote, heavily wooded area near Camden, Tennessee, about 90 miles west of Nashville. The plane had crashed with devastating force, and it was immediately clear that no one could have survived. The deaths of Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Randy Hughes were confirmed. The news hit Nashville like a physical blow, a collective trauma that plunged the close-knit music community into a state of profound shock and grief. It was an unthinkable tragedy, the loss of 4 beloved figures, including its brightest female star, in a single violent moment. For BillyWalker, the public grief was compounded by a private horror. The confirmation of the deaths was also the confirmation of his own miraculous, terrifying survival. He was alive. And he was alive for one reason only. He had given his seat to his friend. The weight of this realization was crushing. He was now inextricably linked to the tragedy, a living ghost of the flight. He was forced to confront the most profound and unanswerable of questions. Why them? Why not me? This was the beginning of a lifelong struggle with survivor's guilt. A psychological burden that would become a permanent part of his emotional landscape. In the days and weeks that followed, he attended the funerals, mourned with his colleagues, and tried to process the sheer randomness of it all. He had to look Jean Shepherd, his friend's newly widowed wife, in the eye, knowing that his act of kindness had inadvertently sent her husband to his death while sparing him. The guilt was a heavy cloak. He later said in interviews that he thought about the crash every single day for the rest of his life. It was a defining moment, a psychological schism that separated his life into 2 distinct parts: the time before the crash and the borrowed time that came after. The only way he knew how to cope was to work. He threw himself into his music with a relentless, renewed sense of purpose. It was as if he needed to justify his survival, to prove to himself and to the world that the life he had been spared would not be wasted. The period immediately following the tragedy became the most commercially successful and creatively fertile of his entire career. It was as if the emotional turmoil and the profound confrontation with his own mortality had unlocked a new depth in his artistry. He scored a series of major hits throughout the mid-1960s. Cross the Brazos at Waco, a dramatic story song about a fugitive's fateful decision, became one of his signature tunes. He recorded a powerful, soulful version of the Percy Sledge R&B classic When a Man Loves a Woman, a bold move that demonstrated his versatility and crossover appeal. His album sold well, and his concerts were packed. On the Opry stage, he was a pillar of strength and professionalism. His calm and steady presence, a comforting balm for a community still healing from its wounds. He found his own personal anchor during this time, marrying his wife Betty and starting a family. Their long and devoted marriage would become a source of immense stability for him, a private sanctuary away from the pressures of his career and the long shadow of his past. He had become the man he was always meant to be, the consummate gentleman, the devoted family man, the respected elder statesman. But under the surface of this idyllic picture, the ghost of that foggy day in March 1963 was never far away. He was living the life that could have, and perhaps should have, belonged to his friend. It was a debt he could never repay, a gift of time he could only hope to honor by living well. This staggering burden of survival, of knowing his life was a direct result of his friend's death, would become the quiet, invisible engine of his next chapter. The ambitious young man who had dreamed of stardom was gone, replaced by a more sober and determined artist, a man with a profound debt to honor. The question that would define the rest of his life was no longer, how can I be a star? But how do I live a life worthy of being spared? He would answer that question not with words, but with decades of unwavering professionalism, timeless music, and a steadfast dedication to his family and his craft, building a career that was both a monument to his talent and a quiet tribute to the friends he had lost. The shadow of the 1963 plane crash would never truly leave BillyWalker, but it did not define him. In its wake, he was left with two things: a profound unspoken grief and the stark unavoidable fact of his own survival. This combination forged in him a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that propelled him into the most successful and prolific period of his career. While the trauma was a private burden, his music became a public testament to his resilience. He channeled the complex emotions of his borrowed time, not into mournful ballads, but into a polished, professional, and deeply felt artistry that cemented his place as one of the signature voices of the 1960s. This was the era in which he didn't just survive, he thrived, building a legacy of grace and consistency that would carry him through the decades to come. The years immediately following the crash saw the Tall Texan become a dominant force on the country music charts. It was as if his brush with mortality had given his smooth baritone a new layer of emotional depth, a subtle gravity that resonated deeply with audiences. He released a string of hits that are now considered classics of the era. In 1964, he recorded Cross the Brazos at Waco, a masterful story song penned by the legendary Kay Arnold. The track was a mini-movie set to music, a tale of a fugitive running from the law, torn between his love for a woman and his desperate need for freedom. Walker's performance was a study in narrative tension, his calm, measured delivery making the song's tragic climax all the more powerful. It became one of his most requested songs, a perfect example of his ability to be a storyteller, not just a singer. He followed this with hits like A, Matter of Life or Death, a title that surely held a deeply personal resonance, and A Woman's Way, a song that perfectly suited his persona as a sophisticated, empathetic gentleman. But perhaps his most notable recording from this period was his 1966 cover of the Percy Sledge R&B masterpiece, When a Man Loves a Woman. At a time when the lines between genres were still rigidly drawn, it was a bold choice. Walker stripped away none of the song's soulful passion, instead infusing it with his own brand of country elegance. While not a major chart success, the recording showcased his versatility and his willingness to build bridges between musical worlds. This musical direction placed BillyWalker squarely at the heart of the dominant aesthetic of the time, the Nashville Sound, later dubbed Countrypolitan. This was a deliberate and commercially brilliant move by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley to broaden country music's appeal. They smoothed out the rough honky-tonk edges, replacing the mournful fiddle and twangy steel guitar with lush string arrangements, sophisticated vocal choruses, and a pop-oriented sensibility. For purists, this was a betrayal of country's raw working-class roots. For the industry, it was a lifeline that created superstars like Jim Reeves, Eddie Arnold, and Patsy Cline, whose posthumous records continued in this style. BillyWalker, with his handsome looks, commanding stage presence, and, most importantly, his smooth crooning voice, was the perfect vessel for the Countrypolitan sound. He was never a hillbilly singer, he was a country balladeer. This became his artistic identity, but it was also the source of a quiet, ongoing debate. Unlike the raw, autobiographical grit of Johnny Cash, the Bakersfield grit of Merle Haggard, or the tortured genius of George Jones, Walker's music was polished, elegant, and controlled. He was more of an interpreter than an innovator, a master craftsman rather than a raw confessional artist. This was both his greatest strength and his greatest limitation. It made him a consistent hitmaker and a beloved mainstream star. But it also meant that later critics and historians, often drawn to the outlaw figures of the genre, would sometimes overlook his contributions. He wasn't dangerous or rebellious, he was reliable. In the turbulent world of the 1960s, reliability was a remarkably valuable, if not always fashionable, commodity. As the decade wore on, his role within the country music ecosystem began to evolve. While he continued to record and tour successfully, his identity became increasingly intertwined with the institution that had been his lifelong dream, the Grand Ole Opry. The Opry was not just another venue. It was the heart and soul of country music, a multi-generational family of performers. As older stars passed on and newer ones arrived, BillyWalker became one of its essential pillars. He was the consummate professional, a man who could be counted on to host a segment, introduce a new artist with genuine warmth, or step up to the microphone and deliver a flawless performance week after week, year after year. To see him on the Opry stage, whether at the old Ryman Auditorium or the new Grand Ole Opry House, was to see a man completely at home. Dressed in a sharply tailored suit, he would command the stage with an easygoing confidence, his banter with the audience feeling less like a performance and more like a conversation with old friends. He became a mentor to countless younger artists, offering advice and encouragement, his dressing room door always open. He understood that the Opry was a living tradition, and he took his role as one of its keepers seriously. He was no longer just a star on the Opry. He was a statesman of the Opry. This unwavering professional stability was mirrored in his personal life. His marriage to his wife, Betty, was a bedrock of support and normalcy. In an industry notorious for its broken homes and public divorces, their devoted lifelong partnership was a quiet inspiration. It grounded him, providing a sanctuary from the pressures of the road and the ghosts of his past. This stability allowed him to navigate the fickle tides of the music business with a grace and perspective that many of his more volatile peers lacked. He had built the life of peace and contentment that he knew had been so narrowly granted to him. By the mid-1970s, the tides of country music were beginning to shift dramatically. The polished Countrypolitan sound that had dominated for over a decade was being challenged by a raw, rebellious new movement. The outlaw wave, led by fellow Texans Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, was a direct rejection of Nashville's slick production. It was gritty, bluesy, and fiercely independent. This was followed in the 1980s by the new traditionalist movement, with artists like George Strait and Randy Travis bringing back the sounds of honky-tonk and western swing. For a classic crooner like BillyWalker, this changing landscape meant a gradual fade from the top of the charts. His style of music, once the height of fashion, was now seen by some as dated. But Billy never made a desperate attempt to change his identity to chase a trend. He was who he was. He watched the new movements rise with the perspective of a seasoned veteran, not with bitterness. He gracefully accepted his transition from a contemporary hitmaker to a living legend. While the number one hits stopped coming, the work never did. His career after his chart peak is a testament to his endurance and his deep connection with his audience. He remained a beloved and busy performer for the rest of his life. He was a constant on the Opry stage, and he maintained a relentless touring schedule, playing to his loyal fan base in theaters, casinos, and country music festivals across the United States and abroad. He was particularly popular in Europe, where his classic style was deeply appreciated. He had cultivated a following that cared less about his current chart position and more about the timeless quality of his voice and the genuine warmth of his performance. He had successfully navigated the most difficult transition for any artist, the move from being a star to being a legacy. He had proven that his time was not just borrowed, it was well spent. This graceful transition from hitmaker to beloved elder statesman cemented his place in the hearts of his fans and the history of the Grand Ole Opry. Having successfully navigated the treacherous currents of the music industry for decades, he had earned a measure of peace and respect that few attain. But BillyWalker was never one to rest on his laurels. For the man who had been given a second chance at life, every day was an opportunity to perform, to connect, to get on the bus and do the work he loved. As he entered his 70s, this tireless dedication to the music would lead him onto the road for one final tour, setting the stage for the last poignant chapter in a life already marked by the incredible and terrible ironies of fate. The passage of time in the world of popular music is a relentless, unforgiving force. Tastes change, new stars rise, and the heroes of one generation often fade into the footnotes of the next. For many artists of BillyWalker's era, the 1980s and 90s were a period of forced retirement or slide into obscurity. But BillyWalker was cut from a different cloth. He had been granted a second act in life, and he intended to play it out to the final note. As he entered his 60s and 70s, he embraced his role as an elder statesman with the same quiet dignity and unwavering professionalism that had defined his entire career. He was no longer a fixture on the music charts, but his status as a living legend was undeniable. His life settled into a comfortable, steady rhythm, centered around the two poles of his existence, his family and the Grand Ole Opry. His marriage to his wife, Betty, remained the anchor of his world, a partnership of deep love and mutual respect that saw them through nearly 4 decades. At the Opry, he was more than just a performer. He was part of the institution's DNA. To watch him in these later years was to see a man who was utterly content in his role. The frantic energy of his hit-making days was replaced by a calm, assured presence. He was a living link to the golden age, a man who had known Hank Williams, toured with Elvis Presley, and mourned Patsy Cline. When he stepped into the spotlight, he brought that entire history with him. He would share stories, crack gentle jokes, and then, when the music started, that smooth, warm baritone, though weathered by age, would fill the auditorium with a timeless grace. What was most remarkable about Billy in these years was his unflagging work ethic. He never lost his love for the road, for the connection with a live audience. He never retired. Long after many of his contemporaries had hung up their guitars, the Tall Texan was still getting on the tour bus. His band was filled with loyal veteran musicians, and his wife, Betty, was almost always by his side. They played smaller theaters, casinos, and community halls, the kinds of venues that keep the heart of country music beating far away from the glamour of Nashville. He wasn't doing it for the fame or the money. He was doing it because it was who he was. He was a troubadour, and the music was as essential to him as breathing. This quiet dedication to his craft, this refusal to fade away, was perhaps the most profound way he honored the borrowed time he had been given. In May of 2006, at the age of 77, BillyWalker was still on the road. He and his band had just finished a series of dates, including a final show at a club in Foley, Alabama. By all accounts, he was in fine form, delivering his classic hits with the same polish and charm he'd had for 50 years. After the show, he, Betty, and two of his band members, bassist Charles Lilly and guitarist Daniel Patton, climbed into his 2000 Ford van to begin the long overnight drive back home to Nashville. It was a scene that had played out thousands of times over his long career. The post-show exhaustion, the hum of the highway, the camaraderie of musicians heading home. Just after midnight on Sunday, May 21st, the van was traveling north on Interstate 65 near Fort Deposit, Alabama. The highway was dark and quiet. For reasons that will never be known, the van suddenly veered off the right side of the interstate, traveled for a short distance along the shoulder, and then flipped over multiple times before coming to rest. The crash was violent and catastrophic. State troopers arriving at the scene found a scene of utter devastation. BillyWalker, his beloved wife Betty, and his two bandmates were all killed. The news of the accident sent a fresh wave of shock and grief through Nashville. The Opry stage was dark that week, its members mourning the loss of one of their most steadfast and beloved figures. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a stunning, almost unbelievable sense of irony. The cosmic joke was so cruel, so profound, it was difficult to comprehend. BillyWalker, the man whose life was forever defined by his miraculous escape from one of the most famous air disasters in music history, had been killed in a common, random, single-vehicle highway accident. The man who had been spared by fate in 1963 had finally been claimed by it, 43 years later, on a lonely stretch of Alabama blacktop. The contrast between the two events is staggering. The 1963 crash was a national tragedy, a dramatic event involving a private plane, terrible weather, and some of the biggest stars of the day. His death was a mundane, tragically ordinary event, the kind that is reported on local news every day. He had cheated death in the most spectacular fashion, only to be taken by it in the most common way. It was a brutal, heartbreaking confirmation of the old adage, when your time is up, it's up. The incredible luck that had granted him a second life had finally, quietly run out. So what is the final legacy of the Tall Texan? It is a story that must be measured not just in hit records, but in character and in time. Musically, he was a master of his craft, a key architect of the smooth, sophisticated Nashville Sound that carried country music to a new level of mainstream acceptance. His voice was an instrument of pure, polished elegance, a comforting and reliable sound for millions of fans. But his human legacy is even more profound. He was, by all accounts, a true gentleman in a business not always known for them. He was a devoted husband, a loyal friend, and a generous mentor. His reputation for kindness and integrity was as much a part of his identity as his famous nickname. And ultimately, there is the inescapable story of his survival. He was the man who lived for 43 years on borrowed time. He never treated that gift lightly. He filled those 4 extra decades with music, with love, and with a quiet dignity that was an inspiration to all who knew him. His life is a powerful, poignant lesson in the fragility of our existence and the unpredictable nature of fate. His miraculous escape taught us that life can be saved by the smallest of chances, and his tragic death taught us that it can be taken away just as easily. BillyWalker's story is one of incredible luck and final, inescapable destiny. He was a good man who made beautiful music and lived a life fuller than he had any right to expect. And in the end, he reminds us to cherish the time we are given, whether it is borrowed or not, and to live it with as much grace as we can muster.